Hello everyone, this is Professor Hosselman, and in today's lecture we're going to be talking about the Protestant Reformation. Now, since before the fall of the Roman Empire more than 1,000 years previously, Europe had been officially and primarily Christian. Declared the official religion of the Roman Empire in 391, Christianity had split into two camps in 1054. Western Europe acknowledged the Bishop of Rome, later known as the Pope, as the Vicar of Rome of Christ. And Eastern Europe, Russia and Christians in the Ottoman Empire, acknowledged an orthodoxy patriarchy based in Constantinople and recognized even by the Ottomans as speaking for the Christians. Still, the Patriarch of Constantinople never had the administrative authority of the Pope. The Russian Orthodox Church, under a patriarch in Moscow, had broken away in 1448, and others would break away to form separate Orthodox churches in the 19th century. Now, nearly every European state established Christianity as its official religion. Rulers were crowned by the church. Bishops had been, until quite recently, the ruler's chief advisors. The church taxed a high proportion of people's income, and the states enforced conformity by requiring attendance at weekly mass and persecuting Christian heretics. Now, Jews, Muslims, and other minority groups were considered second-class citizens, even when they were not persecuted and expelled. Now, from 1295, the Roman Church decreed that Jews should wear badges as a mark of humiliation for their refusal to convert to Christianity. They were prohibited by successive church councils from employing Christians or appearing in public or on Easter or other Christian holidays. And because Christians were forbidden from lending money at interest, Jews found a niche as bankers and moneylenders, a niche that only increased their unpopularity in some quarters. Now, Jews were expelled from England in 1290 and from France in 1306 and again in 1394. In Germany, not a unified country until after the early modern period, the situation varied from place to place. Medieval Spain had been very tolerant of both Muslims and Jews, but as we've seen, Isabella and Ferdinand harried them out of the country. Many fled to Portugal, but in 1497, Manuel I decided on forced conversions, causing many to leave for Greece and North Africa. The glorious exception to this really sad picture was Poland. Now, while church and state generally cooperated in both East and West, there were clashes in the West during the Middle Ages. Western European kings were increasingly uncomfortable with the church's claim to have given them their power. Kings wanted a sole jurisdiction in their lands, and kings resented papal power to tax their subjects. Kings also wanted to appoint bishops because they were also royal vassals and officials. Now, as we saw previously, the early modern church was not in great shape to fight these battles after the French king abducted the papacy to Avignon between 1309 and 1374, and the Great Schism of 1374 to 1417. Now, unity was restored in 1417 when a series of church councils deposed all three competing popes and elected a fourth, Martin V. Now, after the success of these councils, there was hope that the church would become more democratic, and that conciliarism, the idea that the councils should have the power to determine church policy, would make reform possible by giving priests and lay people a voice in church governance. Instead, Martin V and his successors concentrated on reviving and strengthening papal power. Too often, the papacy neglected the obligation to be a moral example. Some popes behaved like great Machiavellian Renaissance princes themselves, which in the long run harmed papal prestige in the sense that popes were spiritual leaders. Now, most people turn to religion to give their hard lives meaning and consolation. Here, we get into an area of great controversy among historians. Traditionally, the medieval Catholic Church has been portrayed as corrupt and unpopular, but this view is often taken directly from works of literature such as Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, or the propaganda of Protestant reformers. But recent archival research illustrative of people's actual lives, wills, church records, donations to clubs, etc., shows a healthier church. Most clergy were doing their jobs under difficult decisions. Most people were Orthodox Catholics, and religious books sold well. The writings of Meister Eckhart and Thomas à Kempis were very popular well beyond Germany. The Devotio Moderno emphasized a practical individual faith that was very popular in the Low Countries. Now, or Holland in that case. That does not mean that everybody was happy in Christendom. There was a shortage of priests who were often poorly educated and sometimes failed to be good moral exemplars. Church courts monitored personal behavior, but had the potential to split communities and breed resentment. From the 13th century, there was in many parts of Europe the Inquisition, which took hearsay evidence, encouraged neighbors to inform on neighbors, and used torture to ferret out people who did not agree with Orthodox Catholicism. Now, penalties ranged from public humiliation, adulterers were made to stand in the town square in a white sheet holding a taper, to horrible death. Heretics were burnt publicly at the stake at a ceremony that came to be known as the auto de fe, or an act of faith. On the other hand, recent researchers indicate that most people hauled before the Inquisition were not burned, and that its reputation was worse than its reality. Now, church taxes were sent far away to Rome. The perception of greed and worldliness of the church was widely resented. Lay people participated minimally in church ritual. Now, these problems produced increased anti-clericalism and grassroots movements to change the church. Now, heresy was the church's term for anyone who disagreed with them. During the Middle Ages, there arose mass movements of Western Catholics, sometimes inspired by theologians, sometimes arising on their own, who had problems with their church, most famously the Albigensians of France, the law lords, and the Hussites. Now, in general, these groups wanted a de-emphasis of the hierarchy and the authoritarianism of the church, an increased role for the laity, a less greedy worldly church with more emphasis on Christ's humility and humanity, and a translation of the scripture into the vernacular. Now, before the 16th century, kings and lay people rarely joined forces in criticizing the church. To condone lay questioning of the Pope would be to condone questioning of all authority, religious and civil. Now, by the late 15th century, Christian humanist writers such as Erasmus, Nicholas de Cusa, Philip Melanchthon, and Ulrich Zwingli also sought reform from within the church. Now, if all three groups, kings, laypeople, and reformers, ever came together, real change would be inevitable. Now, the catalyst of the Protestant Reformation was Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a devout Augustinian priest and professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg. Luther was steeped in the critical method and mentality of Christian humanism, and he was obsessed with his own sinfulness, his unworthiness of God's mercy. He was equally appalled at the worldliness and corruption of the church, especially the church's practice of selling indulgences, that is, the sale of indulgences all over Germany by a Dominican priest named Johann Tetzel, who was trying to raise money for the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Now, Luther, launched the Reformation by posting 95 theses attacking indulgences on the castle church door at Wittenberg on the 31st of October, 1517. Now, because it took a while for the church to respond, Luther and his followers had time to work out the implications of his ideas. One area of fundamental disagreement between 16th century Catholics and Protestants was the source of religious truth. Catholics found religious truth in Scripture, church tradition, and papal and conciliar decisions. Protestant reformers found God's will for his people in the Word, that is, the Scripture, and its working out by the faithful alone. Now, from this radical but simple idea came three equally revolutionary planks of Protestantism. First, the Bible should be translated into the vernacular, printed using new technology of the printing press, and made available to the people. 2. Bibles in hand, there was no need for a corps of professional sacrosanct clergy, including popes, archbishops, and bishops, to interpret it for the people. And 3. Any piece of religious dogma or practice without scriptural foundation should be rejected or abolished out of hand, including the hierarchy of popes and bishops, elaborate rituals in church decor, including crucifixes, images of saints, and so on, and most of the sacraments. Now, Protestants saw the only hope for reform in secular authority, that is, righteous lay rulers. Now, these different attitudes of ministry were paralleled by different attitudes towards salvation. Catholics believed that salvation was won through two mutually supported means: faith, that is, belief in God, in the resurrection of Jesus Christ and his church, and 2, the performance of good works, especially the 7 sacraments, which forgave sins and produced grace. Now, Protestants, on the other hand, believed that no human being could merit salvation through his or her own efforts. Salvation was entirely up to God. Faith alone justified the individual in God's eyes. Sacraments might or might not be useful in including an individual towards God, or inclining, an individual towards God, but they did not automatically result in forgiveness or salvation. That would be telling God what to do. Now, indeed, other rituals, the whole apparatus of priests, sacraments, processions, blessings, holy water, the sign of the cross, veneration of images, and so on, were at best useless and at worst mere superstition and idolatry. Now, one Swiss Protestant reformer by the name of John Calvin went further, arguing in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, which he wrote in 1536, that God, who knows all things, has already determined who is saved, or the elect, or damned, the reprobate. Now, unlike previous heresies, Protestant ideas survived. Weakened by corruption and perhaps overconfident, the Church did not act decisively. It excommunicated Martin Luther only in 1521, and it made little response in print, giving Luther and his followers a clear field and time to get their message out. Now, Luther benefited from two coincidental historical developments. The invention of the printing press in Germany in the mid-15th century enabled Luther's ideas and translations of the Bible to spread rapidly. And secondly, rising literacy, to about 15 to 20% of the total population in 1600, also allowed for the rapid spread of Luther's ideas. Now, Luther also received government support and protection. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, opposed Luther's ideas and summoned him to answer a charge of heresy at the Diet of Worms in April of 1521. There, courageously, Luther refused to recant. The Diet responded by declaring him an outlaw. If Luther had been living in a more centralized monarchy such as Spain, France, or even England, his life would have been forfeit. But Luther lived in Germany, where the central authority of the emperor was weak and the German princes were strong. Some princes, mostly in the north, agreed with Luther, and Frederick the Wise, the Elector of Saxony, gave him sanctuary. Thanks to this support, and because of the Holy Roman Emperor, in part because he never explored the New World, was weak and poor, Protestantism spread across Europe in northern Germany, Bohemia, France, England, Scotland, and even Scandinavia.